Winters here in Britain are often cold, wet and pretty miserable. Most winters will see temperatures of around -10 to -11 degrees Celsius in northern areas of England. Some areas of Scotland get down to -15 degrees Celsius fairly regularly. The coldest temperature last year was nearly -19 degrees Celsius in Scotland. And the coldest temperature ever recorded in the UK was of course in Scotland in the winter of 1982, where temperatures reached -27 degrees Celsius. Sleeping under a tarp is a common thing to do here in the UK, as winters in general will consist of cold, wet rain and strong winds. With that in mind, here are 5 of my favourite winter bushcraft and camping tarp setups for the UK. First up is the Adirondack Shelter. This tarp setup derives from the 3-sided log shelters that were popularised in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. These shelters were developed as a convenient place to camp for fishing and hunting groups. You can manipulate a tarp to form an Adirondack style shelter, which will protect you from the elements from 3 sides. It will have plenty of space inside for you and your gear, as well as help you to retain the heat from a nearby campfire. To set the shelter up, I tie a ridgeline between 2 trees. To do this, I tie a loop in one end of the ridgeline, and I pass this loop around the tree, and then put the remaining end of the cordage through this loop and put a stick through it. Now I can cinch down tight on the paracord, and the stick will hold the loop in place and stop it from slipping. Then I walk the ridgeline across to the opposite tree and wrap it around. I then loop underneath the ridgeline and back around the other way of the tree. This will help to put even more tension on the ridgeline. I then make a small U-shape and pass another small loop through this loop and pull it away from the tree to tighten it. Then I put my hand through this loop and grab the remaining paracord and pull it through to form a second loop, which I can then put a small stick through to stop it slipping. Now I secure some small loops of paracord to the ridgeline, which will help tension the tarp. These are called prosic loops. To tie these, I wrap the cordage over the ridgeline and back through the loop twice, which creates a sort of fist shape. This knot allows me to slide it back and forth across the ridgeline if I hold it by the knot itself, but if I pull from the lower end of the loop, it locks on itself and grips to the ridgeline. For the Adirondack Shelter, I tie 2 of these prosic loops to the ridgeline. Next, I fold one corner of the tarp over the ridgeline. I then find the tie-out point that is 2 away from the corner tie-out point and secure this to the prosic loop on the ridgeline. To do that, I put the knot of the prosic loop through the tarp tie-out point and then place a stick between this, and now I can pull the prosic loop away from the tarp and it will cinch down on the knot. Then I do the exact same thing to the opposite side of the tarp. Now I need to peg down the bottom of the tarp. To do that, I try to make a square shape. So I find the tie-out point that is opposite the one on the ridgeline and peg that corner down. I tuck in any excess tarp and do the same to the opposite side. You can see that I am doing this in less than ideal conditions, with a strong southwesterly wind coming through the woods. Notice that I am making the shelter so that the back is facing the wind. With the back tied down, now I need to peg out the corner tie-out points at an angle. And this is where the Adirondack shape comes into play. As we already have the back of our shelter, we just need to make the sides. Once I've pegged out one corner, I will do the exact same thing to the opposite side. To create the roof, I just place a stick through the corner tie-out point, making sure it has a slight downward slope to shed any rain. Then I peg this guy line to the ground. I like to make an adjustable knot on this tie-out point, as generally in winter the winds will be strong and you need to tighten your guy lines regularly. To make an adjustable guy line hitch, I wrap the paracord around the peg and then wrap it over and inside itself twice. Then I form a small loop and pass the tag end through this loop. This is a quick release loop, which will make undoing it much easier. Now to tighten the guy line, I just pull the knot towards the tarp, and to loosen it, I pull the knot towards the peg in the ground. You can stow away the remaining paracord by wrapping it up and tucking it in the loop of the guy line hitch, and that's how I make a basic Adirondack style shelter, which has plenty of room inside for gear and to sleep in. However, you can make even more space by tying out the middle point of the tarp. You'll notice that I have some cordage already tied onto the back loop of the tarp. This is so that whenever I make this type of shelter, I just unravel the cordage, wrap it around the stick a few times, and then peg this to the ground. Now there is even more room inside the tarp for me and my gear, and if the weather really turns nasty with heavy rain, I just loosen the guy line of the roof and then peg it down straight to the ground. This creates a more enclosed shelter and protects me from the elements. Tarps are a highly versatile piece of kit. This particular tarp is only 2.9 by 3 meters wide, and it's so lightweight that I keep it in my kit all the time. But what if you don't have two trees close together? How can you use a tarp as a shelter? Well, you can actually make a totally freestanding tarp shelter without the need for any ridgeline. To do this, first lay your tarp out in a flat square on the ground. You can peg out each of the 4 corners to pull it tight. Then, peg out the 2 tie-up points that are right next to the corner tie-up points. As each peg goes in, I pull each tie-up point out diagonally so that the tarp keeps its tension. I then take out the corner pegs and tuck this piece of material underneath the tarp. This is going to be the back of the shelter, so make sure this section is facing the wind. I only do this to the 2 back corners of the tarp. Now I go to the front of the tarp. I take the very corner tie-up point and unpeg it. Then I find the next tie-up point along from it and add about 6 inches. Then I flip the corner tie-up point to here and peg it in. I do the same thing to the other side. Find the tie-up point next to the corner one, unpeg the corner, add around 6 inches, and peg the corner tie-up point in. This will form the front of the shelter. Then I cut a branch about the thickness of my wrist. I use my knife to bevel one end of the stick to make it as smooth as possible, as this is going to push up against the inside of the tarp. I then put this stick underneath the centre of the tarp, making sure it is as straight as possible. You can add a cut-out tennis ball or a sock to the top of the stick to prevent it from causing any wear against the tarp. I then tie a guy line to the next tie-up point that is adjacent to the front corner of the shelter. I fold this part of the tarp back on itself and tie this off to the back corner peg using an adjustable guy line hitch. I do the same to the opposite side. To finish the shelter off, I add another guy line to the front centre point of the tarp to tie out the entrance and help to shed the rain away from the shelter. Now I have a low profile tarp tent that is very well protected from the elements. It works really well in strong winds as it has so many angles to it, which deflect the wind. The entrance to the shelter is small, but it keeps you from being exposed to the elements. There is still room enough inside for me and my gear. This tent can be even easier to make if you use an adjustable hiking pole for the centre instead of a stick. That way you have an easier way to keep the shelter taut. But what about hammock campers? What's the best tarp setup for winter hammock camping? Well, my personal favourite is a diamond fly. This offers best protection against the elements in particularly heavy rain, as it has a sharp angle to shed the water. There are different ways of tying this tarp formation, some with a ridgeline, some without. For this example, I am not going to use a ridgeline. Instead, I have guy lines tied to each of the 4 corners of the tarp. I tie one corner of the tarp to a tree just above head height. There are a number of knots you can use, but I use a Siberian hitch. If you want to learn how to tie it, I recommend watching my tarp setups video below. Once you have tied off that corner, tie off the opposite diagonal corner to the other tree. Note that the tarp is tied out so that it is in a diagonal fashion. This is where the diamond shape will be made. Once you have tied out those 2 ends, you should have just 2 remaining guy lines. Grab these and peg the tarp out as vertical as possible. That way water will not sit on the tarp and make it sag. It also helps to prevent the wind from ripping through underneath the tarp. Then do the same to the opposite side. And that's it. A simple diamond fly tarp setup, great for hammock camping in adverse weather conditions. All you need to do now is string your hammock between the trees. The great thing about this setup is that if the weather conditions allow it, you can quickly adapt it to get much more space underneath. All you need to do is undo one of the side guy lines and take it further out to the side and tie it to the nearest tree around head height. The other side should be the one that is protecting you from the wind. Now you have an open view of the forest, as well as the space to have a fire nearby and still stay dry. If there is little to no wind, you can even open up the shelter to get a full 360-degree view. If the wind or rain picks up again, just peg the corners back in the ground and hunker down. The next shelter is, in my opinion, the fastest tarp shelter that you can set up. And for those of you thinking, well, these tarp setups are great and all, but what if the wind changes? Isn't it going to be a faff having to undo them and move them around? Well, that is where the plough point shelter comes in. You can be even more prepared for this setup by having your tarp stuffed into the side pouch of your backpack. Then, when I need to deploy a shelter quickly, all I need to do is pull the tarp out of the side pocket of the pack, secure one corner of it to the tree just above head height. Then I pull my backpack away from the tree and peg out the remaining tie-up points. You'll notice that I haven't needed to use any guy lines. When all the tie-up points are pegged out, I just take the last corner piece of the tarp out of my pack, pull the tarp tight and peg it down. And that's it. I have an instant shelter that is set up in a matter of minutes. And if the wind changes to a different direction, then no problem. I just unpeg the tie-up points, rotate the tarp around the tree so that the back of the shelter is facing the wind, and then repeg it out. This shelter has plenty of space inside for sleeping and gear. And if I want to increase the space inside the shelter, I can do what I did with the Adirondack Shelter at the beginning of the video and tie this off to a nearby tree. The one thing to be aware of when setting up this style of shelter, especially in windy conditions, is if there are any dead branches in the tree above your head. Try to avoid setting this shelter up under trees with precarious looking branches. If you are more of a ground sleeper and you like to sleep next to an open fire, then one of the best shelters to keep warm is a low profile stealth shelter. For this, I tie 3 prusik loops to the ridgeline. Then I lay my tarp out flat on the ground, with the front of it just underneath the ridgeline. Then I find the middle tie-up point at the front and secure this to the middle prusik loop above it. I do the same thing to the next 2 loops either side of the middle tie-up point, securing them to the wood toggles so that the tension of the tarp can be adjusted easily. Then I peg down the last 2 front tie-up points to the ground, which finishes off the opening of my shelter. There is now lots of wasted tarp at the back of the shelter, which I tuck underneath itself to be used as a ground sheet to keep me dry from the damp forest floor. Then I peg down the 3 tie-up points, which are opposite the prusik loops of the ridgeline. I'll then peg out the next 2 tie-up points to the side of these, and I will finish it off by pegging out any remaining tie-up points, making sure that the tarp is pulled tight. Now I have a low profile stealth tarp shelter, which has its own built-in ground sheet. This type of shelter is great for strong winds, as it is low to the ground and only has a small footprint. However, it can be pretty restrictive in terms of space. But if you have a fire just in front of it, you can get the shelter really warm, as it traps the heat very efficiently. And those are 5 of my favourite tarp shelter setups for winter bushcraft and camping. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe, and be sure to check out my wilderness survival and bushcraft skills playlist for many more videos on this type of topic. Cheers for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.